Got it. We got it.
Could Rich turn those down?
Your first is the question that was the picture. Is that your second
My husband's in
question?
the same, yeah. Well, what's it gonna do when you have to do?
Number 8 and 16.
Ready to go? All right. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the January 18, 2024 Groton-Dunstable Regional School District School Committee meeting. Tonight, we're having the third of our superintendent finalist interviews. We have Mr. John Buckey joining us. We will go around the room as we have the last few interviews, asking our questions. We'll make 2 rounds. Approximately 75 minutes of interviewing, but probably a little bit more. Behind us, the QR code is up for everybody to use, or the link to send your feedback. And on that note, I think we will get started. Welcome.
Thank you.
So, first question. Tell us about yourself and why you chose Groton-Dunstable. Now that you've visited the district, what have you identified as Groton-Dunstable's strengths and or weaknesses? What skills do you possess that will support those strengths or resolve our weaknesses and make us a better district? And what priorities would you include as part of an entry plan for your superintendency? I also want to, because of some of the complexities that we had discussed in the parent meet and greet, about your history with Marblehead, I'd like to give you the opportunity to speak to that before we go through our full round of questions.
Sure. I apologize for people that have heard this now maybe for the 3rd time today, but John Buckey, born and reared in Newcomerstown, Ohio. I have no reason to believe anyone knows where Newcomerstown, Ohio is, but it's the home of Cy Young and Woody Hayes. So if you're a sports fan, that gives you some context. Product of public education, graduated in a class of 78 students, went to Asbury College, started as a broadcast journalism major, thinking that I would major in broadcasting, cross the street to Asbury Theological Seminary, and become a United Methodist minister. Spoiler alert, that is not the path that my life took. I switched my major in the spring of my freshman year to education. I knew I always wanted to be a teacher, so majored in secondary education and Spanish. Took a job as a Spanish teacher and world language department head at an independent school in Lexington, a K-9 school, not dogs, but kindergarten through 9th grade, and was there for 3 years before I received an invitation to apply to the Harvard Graduate School of Education, where I studied administration, planning, and social policy, got my master's at Harvard. After that, I took a job as a dean of students at an all-girls boarding school in Cleveland, Ohio. And if that sounds like a terrible decision, it was indeed. I was there for a year, and the head of the board was asked to step down. The new head of the board fired the head of school, and the head of school scorched the earth on the way out and fired every administrator but me and the director of the equestrian center. I figured that was not an auspicious beginning to my administrative career, so I looked to come back east. I took a job with the Littleton Public Schools right here in your neck of the woods. I interviewed for the assistant principal's job at a Pizzeria Uno's in Kenmore Square. The principal at the time, Bob DeSaulnier, said, I am going to retire in 4 years, and I'm looking for a partner in this work, somebody that I can mentor into the principalship. And he stayed true to that promise and provided me a lot of opportunities that an average assistant principal wouldn't have. 4 years later, I was named principal of Littleton High School. I had an opportunity to take a job as the high school principal on Nantucket, where I spent 12 years as the high school principal, being named Massachusetts High School Principal of the Year in 2013. I knew I wanted to be a superintendent, and on Nantucket there is one opportunity for that. And so I needed to move to America, as the people on the island would say, and was hired by the Marblehead Public Schools to be their superintendent of schools. I was hired in January of 2020. And so the priorities, the direction, the goals of the district were changed, understandably, by a little thing called COVID. And so I enjoyed 3 years of exemplary and proficient evaluations from the school committee and the support of the board. We had an election on June 21st of this year where the composition of the board changed, and within 2 weeks they were moving to leverage a provision in my contract that was separation cause. I was never given a reason. I would have remained in Marblehead, but it was clear that it did not serve the district and our students and staff for me to fulfill the remaining 2 years that I had left on my contract. So I don't think that the district was served by a school committee openly being at odds with the superintendent. So we reached that separation agreement. I am now currently employed by the Peabody Public Schools as a bilingual re-engagement coordinator. It is a position for the next 6 months, January to June. They have had a number of students move into the district as a result of the southern border crossing, families living in hotels on Route 1, enrolling in Peabody High School and being overwhelmed and then just not coming back. And they have a number of programs, a Peabody Learning Academy at the North Shore Mall. They have a night school, they have a community school, they have one of 6 virtual schools in the Commonwealth, which is a district in and of itself within Peabody Public Schools. And so they're looking for someone to connect families and students to the myriad opportunities they have beyond just a traditional 7-period-a-day, 45-minute classes at Peabody High School. And so that's the work that I'm currently doing, which leverages my background as a Spanish teacher, as a high school principal, and as somebody with central office experience. Groton-Dunstable's reputation speaks for itself as a highly competitive regional school district. You have exceptional, if you look at the scores and district metrics that you'll find on the department school profiles. In 10th grade, of the 10 comparative districts that you have, you're number 1 in ELA, in math, and in student growth percentages. So I would be honored to have the opportunity to become part of the Groton Public Schools. There are opportunities here. I wouldn't call them weaknesses or challenges, but similar to many districts, and I don't want to preempt anyone's future budget question, but you're facing what many communities are with ESSER funds being gone, ARPA funds being gone, that financial cliff that if you invested in things that need to become part of the recurring operational budget, you're going to need funding for those. In addition to maintaining the current level of programs and services that you have. You had a multi-part question, and I'd want to make sure that I've hit.
What skill set do you possess that supports the strengths or resolves our weaknesses, and what priorities would you include as part of an entry plan for your superintendency?
I think God gave us one mouth and two ears. My priority coming in would be to listen and learn with a 90-day entry plan, having 90 meetings in 90 days, having a set of questions posed to all of our stakeholders to find out what are the priorities of the district. What do different stakeholders see as important, as opportunities to make an exemplary school district even better? And then reporting those out to the school committee as part of a report of entry findings. And then aligning those with the administrative team for programs and services and budgets moving forward. I know that you've recently adopted a new strategic plan, not adopted, in works of adopting a new strategic plan. And so seeing how that fits into some of the financial realities of the district and how those can be funded or realigned for moving the strategic plan forward. And I think some of my skills is relationship building. I like to be out and involved in the community and the schools, and I think relationships build trust, and trust enables us to move the district forward. I'm proud to have the endorsement of the three town administrators I worked for in the 3 years that I was in Marblehead, to have the police chief, the fire chief, the chair of the finance committee, the former chair of the finance committee, and those mirrored on Nantucket, the town manager, the chair of the finance committee, in being a partner in the work and knowing that the schools are oftentimes the biggest part of any town budget, and at the same time the largest employer in most communities, and to have a positive working relationship and build trust in community that will help to move the district forward.
So I want to give the table the opportunity to ask any questions about the sort of things that we've been hearing through social media and reading out, getting receipts from and emails and that about some of Mr. Buckey's relationships in Marblehead. If there's any questions from the table, I want you to address those now, and then we can move on with the remainder of our questions. And I hope you appreciate that I'm doing this because I want to be as transparent and open about the conversation and address them as best we can.
I appreciate it.
Thank you. Does anybody have any questions? Okay, hearing none. We will, yeah, go ahead, Rafi.
It's more of a comment, I guess, but it might be helpful to reiterate what you said in the parent forum about this very issue.
Agreed. Regarding Metco and
yes.
some of the concerns about lawsuits.
I will just say that the separation agreement with Marblehead was the right thing to do for the district. I loved the work that I was doing. We were doing good work, but we were not able to continue that work collaboratively. And so I don't have any animus toward Marblehead or people in the community. It is profoundly confusing to me that people would follow me to districts to malign the work that we did to do proactive outreach, because we made the right decision. I made the right decision not to hold them to my 2-year contract, that was in the best interest of our students and staff in a district that had limited resources. And so I learned of the lawsuit filed by a former employee by reading about it in the Salem Evening News. I've never been served. There is no active servant, the district has not been served. And so I would reach out to Metco Inc., and I've reached out to the executive director, Millie, and asked her. She said she would be willing to speak to the work that I did with Metco Inc. and the support that I gave the organization. I had our school committee go into Boston and hold a school committee meeting at Metco headquarters. I rode the Metco bus with our students to and from school one day. I was an active participant, and so the characterizations I can't speak to in what I read in the Salem Evening News, but as employers, you know that oftentimes an employee can say things that a district cannot respond to. And at that point, I cannot, but I would direct people to Metco Inc. to speak to the executive director about how I worked with that organization.
Okay, any further questions? If not, we'll go around and begin our questions. Thank you very much. Roseanne?
Good evening.
Hi.
Describe your experiences with conducting a curriculum audit and implementing new curriculum initiatives, and what methods do you use to assess the effectiveness of instructional programs while identifying content areas?
Great. When I arrived in Marblehead, the math curriculum was 20 years old and no longer supported by the publisher. And so it was during COVID, and we needed to make a curriculum adoption somewhat quickly and not as in-depth as I would have hoped. We also we ended up with illustrative math, but I'm going to speak to the curriculum adoption process that we are recently coming through with a literacy curriculum. Also, in my first year, I was walking through a building with a principal, and I said, "What is our literacy curriculum?" And she said, "I have no idea," which is a bit alarming to a new superintendent. But to her credit, she was right. There was no literacy curricula. When I was in Marblehead, I said it is a system of schools, not a school system, because it had a number of neighborhood schools, and your education and experience depended on the school you attended and further the teacher that you were assigned. So we set up to do a literacy adoption after the mathematics adoption, and I think by contract here, similarly, you can't have more than one curriculum adoption in a year. Mm-hmm. And so with the literacy curriculum adoption, we engaged a very robust process. We consulted with Salem State and partnered with them as an adoption consultant. We used the state's Curate framework that has curriculum materials, and they vet them according to how they align with the state frameworks. We put together a representative task force of elementary teachers, special educators, administrators, and parents who worked through to identify 4 or 5 different literacy curricula that would align with our Foundations Phonics curriculum. We then sent educators out to districts where these curriculum materials were being used, that they could see teachers using the curriculum materials, teaching lessons, provided an opportunity for them to meet with teachers to talk about the resources, and if they liked the program, what they liked, what they would change. We then narrowed that down to 2 finalists. We then had teachers in district and our literacy specialists and our curriculum coaches do demo lessons with the curriculum, and then have teachers observe that and then take them back to their classrooms. We invited parents in to consider the 2 finalists, to see the resource materials, the anthologies, the decodable text that came with each program, and then we ultimately made the decision on wit and wisdom. We used ESSER funding and ARPA. It was a fairly significant investment, I think $400,000, because we went with the robust professional development package. This past summer, we stipended teachers to come in and work with wit and wisdom representatives, our curriculum coaches, and our literacy specialists, so that on day 1, they would be prepared to launch the new curricula. For me, to see if a curriculum is effective is being out and in classrooms. And I'm proud that last year, doing instructional walkthroughs, we completed over 350 distinct classroom visits, which, as the superintendent, working with the assistant superintendent for curriculum and instruction and the building-based leaders, provides an opportunity for us to see instruction and then to go back and align our practice on what is it that we saw. And someone may see something very differently than someone else, and that's building and mentoring and coaching our administrative team so that when they're in classrooms, that they're providing robust feedback to staff on the instructional practices that align with the curriculum resources we put in place.
Thank you.
Welcome. So my question is, I want to briefly lay out a real scenario that you'll be facing if you become the superintendent of the Groton-Dunstable Regional School District, and hear how you will respond to this scenario. Wages and benefits make up approximately 70% of our school district's budget, which is pretty typical. Most unions and districts are settling for between 2.5% to 3.5% annual raises. We have step and lane movement that causes the total growth rate of salaries to be even higher than our negotiated raises. The costs and benefits is growing even faster than wage growth. In our towns, our local revenues are only increasing at 2.5% based on Proposition 2.5 and 0.5% based on a new growth for a total of 3%. This clearly means that expenses are growing faster than revenues. So a few questions here. First is, have you been in this type of situation previously? Given this is the situation you would be facing as the superintendent of our district for the foreseeable future, what budget would you propose? Level services, whatever the cost, live within local revenue, whatever the cuts, something in between, and why? And then lastly, could you tell me about rephrase here. How do you defend your recommended budget to families with students impacted by your choices? If you choose the cuts, you're going to be impacting students, and if you choose, to maintain services, there are definitely individuals within our community that feel like they're being taxed out of the community. So how do you respond to both sides?
Unfortunately, I am coming through the nightmare scenario that you are envisioning. In Marblehead, there was an over-reliance on free cash, and as we all know, there's no such thing as free cash. It would be E&D in your regional school district, and limited opportunity for growth. And so I don't think that Amazon is going to be opening in Groton or Dunstable anytime soon, but is there an economic development council in either community? Are there opportunities for projected growth? Likely not for FY25 as we face the financial cliff of ESSER and ARPA going away. We developed, the budget process for me is very iterative, that where we start is almost never where we end up, and it is including school committee budget directives to the superintendent. These are the priorities, or these are the directives we want the superintendent to undertake as the development process is going, of engaging stakeholders, providing community forums where the superintendent is listening to where the communities are and what their priorities are. How do they align with the budget directives that have been set forth by the school committee? Having principals and directors meet with their stakeholders, their PTOs, their parent organizations, their school councils, their faculties, to develop the building base and programmatic budgets. They then bring those to me and the business manager to talk about the building level developed budget. Questions that I ask, are you anticipating any retirements? Will there be any savings via retirement? Are there staff that you know that will be moving on? Will those staff be replaced, or could that salary be repurposed for something that you're looking for in your budget? Enrollment. You're looking at fluctuating enrollment in Groton-Dunstable. I think you have a senior class of 175 and a kindergarten class of 146. That's a section, if not two, in your elementary schools. So looking at that, approving the building-based and director-level budgets, special services, technology, human resources, and then having them come to school committee and present their building-based and their department budgets, giving school committee yet another opportunity to be involved in the budget development process. We leveraged a technology program last year called Thought Exchange, where people could go on. It's different than an ordinary survey where you have 4 choices or a Likert scale to rate something 1 to 5. We ask an open question. What do you feel the budget priorities for the district should be for FY24? I think if COVID taught us anything, there are a lot of keyboard warriors that have been developed. And so to go on and answer, I think we should have a new literacy curriculum. I think there should be more copy machines at the high school. People then can go in and read the responses that people put and rate them 1 to 5 stars. And so that provides data where people who might not be comfortable speaking up in a public forum, advocating for a new literacy curriculum, and then taking that information, bringing it back to school committee to say, these are the priorities that stakeholders have identified. These are the ones that got 4.8 to 5 stars. And the analytics behind the program is pretty robust, pretty deep, in that people that might be diametrically offering very different priorities for the budget, it can go in and see where they rated other things and then find consonants, kind of that Venn diagram of where there's overlap in their thinking. And I think the budget process is about data and being able to tell the story through historical analysis. What have the expenses been over the last 3 to 5 years? COVID puts a blip in there, but I think we're getting in the budget development process now where we can go back 3 to 5 years and get an accurate representation. I'm sure you all were surprised last year by the OSD 14% increase in out-of-district special education tuitions. Nobody saw that coming. And building relationships in the community with the stakeholders, with the town manager, with the town administrator, with the finance committees, that they trust that you mean what you say and say what you mean, and that you have the data to back up the requests that are coming forward, and working collaboratively. What happened in Marblehead is we put together the aspirational budget, and that was almost immediately dismissed out of hand. And we were asked to do a level services and a level funded. Level services, as we know, is just keeping the lights on and rolling forward whatever program services and personnel you have into the next fiscal year. Level funded would have required us to make 30 cuts. And we had excruciating conversations around the leadership table of what those cuts would be. Identified a middle school librarian freshman athletics, a paraprofessional at the high school who had been there for 23 years, an administrative assistant at one of the elementary schools. And unfortunately, the override passed. Fortunately, the override passed overwhelmingly at town meeting, and then when it got to the ballot box, fell short in passing. The new school committee coming in asked that I go back and review those cuts, and I was not willing to horse trade my values for the political expediency of that. We spent months telling our stakeholders that if the override does not pass, these will be the painful cuts that need to be made. And to have employees who left the district proactively because their position was on that list, to have the superintendent say, oh, just kidding, we weren't really going to do that, was not something that I'm willing to do, because I think that speaks to credibility and transparency when you're developing the FY25 budget, to tell the finance committee, if we don't get this, then we're going to have to do that. Their response would likely be, but you didn't do it last year. So that is a bit of, I hopefully touched on each part of your question.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you.
So education data indicates that students receiving special education services in Massachusetts is 19.3%. As a superintendent, what measures would you take to close the achievement gap between the general education students and students who receive special education services? How will you monitor the progress of these students?
As you look at the Groton-Dunstable data, it is a bit concerning for special education students at grades 10, 8, 5, and 4 that no student is exceeding expectations. And that jumped out at me as I looked at your data. And so I wonder, first it begins with the identification process, the initial evaluation, and then the service delivery. Are we complying with service delivery and getting students what they need? Are we progress monitoring that our students, the goals outlined in the IEP, being met? And we need to make sure we're not writing goals that are immeasurable, that don't have actual metrics associated with them, that there is a quantitative measure to that success, and then using that data to evaluate our programs and services. If students consistently are not meeting that, then bringing the team back together to find out what interventions might better serve the student with the diagnosed disability. I know you have some great programs in district for students on the autism spectrum. Are there ways to bring programs in-house? I know you have the collaborative for out of district, but is there a way to maintain students in Groton-Dunstable by bringing a program in-house rather than having that as an out of district tuition?
Thank you.
So I'm going to share a current situation at our high school with regard to scheduling and class size. We have a block schedule at our high school. This comes with certain advantages and disadvantages. At a recent school committee meeting, the administration presented data showing that we have a total of 147 sections at the high school. 26 of these sections have over 25 students, and 18 sections have less than 15. The average teacher load at the high school is 60 students per teacher. Do you draw any immediate conclusions from these numbers? Do you support block schedules versus another type of schedule, and why or why not? If the school committee wanted you to evaluate the current schedule for possible changes, tell me about the process you would go through to gather data and present a recommendation. Who would you charge with leading this process? What if there was staff pushback because it resulted in staff reductions and teachers having to take on a higher load, how would you handle that objection?
I remember when I was doing my administrative internship in Watertown, the principal at the time asked me to explore open campus for lunch. And as I reached out to districts, they said, if you have an open campus, you are trying desperately to close it. And if you don't have an open campus, your stakeholders are trying desperately to get you to go to open campus. As a high school principal for 15 years, I explored a block schedule for many of the benefits of a lower class load for teachers and number of students that they're seeing, fewer preps, but we couldn't get there. We were on a traditional 7-period, 45-minute, brought in experts in block scheduling. And I say that because I think people who have a block schedule are looking to get out of the block sometimes, and those who don't have a block schedule are looking to the benefits of what a block schedule can bring. I don't know what the current schedule, I know, having scheduled a high school for 15 years under the traditional model, that singletons are the driver of the schedule. If you only have one AP biology section, one forensic section, one AP Lang, and then you have 3 sections of CP English 1, there can be 22 in one section, 7 in the next section, and 14 in the third section. And so scheduling high schools is very complicated. I would want to get a sense of where the faculty and staff and students are. The reason we didn't move to the block is because it was a 60-40 split. And for me, that was not enough to move an entire high school to a scheduling program where 40% of people would be unhappy from the get-go. And so if there is a profound interest in changing, I would want to engage focus groups, listening sessions. What is the emphasis behind the change? Is it that we have too many sections that are oversubscribed of 26 students? Is it that teachers feel the 82-minute block is too long and a student isn't getting Algebra 1 the same way in a semester as they would over the course of a year? As a former language teacher, language teachers were vehemently opposed to the block schedule because they felt that learning, that compressed learning a language did a disservice to students, in particular if they took Spanish 1 in the fall of their freshman year and Spanish 2 wasn't offered until spring of their sophomore year. And so there are trade-offs on any given schedule, and sometimes the grass isn't always greener on the other side, but that does not mean you shouldn't explore it. And listening to your students and staff, particularly at the high school, students should be involved in those conversations, in that process, because having 7 classes is much different than having 4 classes. But at the same time, if it's so condensed and so compressed, it makes it difficult for them to really have mastery of the material. So I think it's an engagement process of listening to faculty. Where is the change coming from? If it's coming from school committee, what is behind the school committee's interest in making a change at the high school? And it could be financial, it could be personnel, it could be programs. And so listening and hearing and then proceeding through a process to consider a change. Did I touch on each of your parts?
I think following up very quickly with that question is that I think where it was very informative and instructive, and I did appreciate it, but I think in my head, what I'm wanting to ask is, but you know that the right thing to do is something than what the majority is telling you.
Yep.
Then what do you do?
Sometimes being the leader requires you to make difficult decisions. And I had a superintendent that said, people will often say, you're not listening to me. And what they mean is you're not hearing what I want you to hear. And sometimes it comes down to the superintendent having to make a difficult decision. But knowing that the data is not on, you want to make sure that when you're making the difficult decision, that you have the data and the rationale to back it up. It's not just because somebody, a angry group on Rotten Groton is controlling the narrative.
Okay, thank you.
Dr. Buckey, it's nice to see you again.
Thanks, it's good to be seen.
Welcome back to Groton-Dunstable. How do your educational values influence your approach to improving student achievement, and how would you apply this philosophy in our district? Could you provide an example of how you have implemented the philosophy in a past role to enhance student learning outcomes?
I think saying what you mean, meaning what you say, building trust among stakeholders so that they believe in that you're providing a transparent view into your values and beliefs. Integrity, honesty, empathy are core values for me. I think this work is extremely hard and is not getting easier. Every year after COVID, we say this year is going to be better, and it hasn't happened yet. And it's not through lack of trying, but I think we don't presume positive intent, that everyone is approaching this work with the goal of doing what's best for our students to provide them an exemplary education. Remind me of your question again.
I guess your educational values and how they, improve the student achievement, but here, and could you provide an example of how you've implemented that philosophy in some of your past roles?
I think it comes from putting students first. And at the end of the day, everyone wants our students to have the best experiences that they can have. Coming through the budget cycle last year was a very difficult process. And I think it would have been politically expedient to say, no, we're not going to cut freshman athletics. And spoiler alert, Algebra 2 does not bring every student to school every day. Athletics are important, and I would never advocate against them. But when you tell people something, you need to maintain integrity that what you told them was the truth. And I think that leads to positive outcomes for students, that we are not willing to sacrifice what's best for them for political expediency.
Thank you.
Welcome. So I have a three-part question. I'll give them to you at once, and then if you want me to go back and repeat anything, I'm happy to do that. So what do you see as being key components to developing and maintaining a strong school community and a supportive school culture that encourages students to work hard and to grow in their learning? Are you familiar with culture and climate surveys, and have you ever used them to inform your decision-making process? And then can you tell us some specific things that you either have done or would do to improve a school district's culture?
Go with part one again, please.
Okay. What do you see as being the key components to building a strong school community and culture?
Collaboration. I think the role of the superintendent is to know the schools well in order to make the schools well-known. And you can't know the schools well if you're not out and actively engaged in them. And parents in Marblehead would joke that Dr. Buckey would show up at the opening of an envelope. And I took great pride in that, because being at the 8th grade civics fair, being at an elementary school robotics competition, being at the high school musical, attending sporting events, makes people feel valued. It's great to walk through Stop and Shop and have a 3rd grader tug on his mother's arm and say, "That's Dr. Buckey, he's the superintendent, he was in my class today." And we did over 350 individual classroom visits as a superintendent and assistant superintendent last year. That builds culture. It built to a point where initially having the superintendent, the assistant superintendent, and the building administrators walk in is a bit intimidating. But over time, over the 3 years that I was there, people started emailing, "I'm doing this great project, this Socratic with my freshman English class. I'd love for you and Nan to come in and observe it." And so I think that that builds positive school culture, and that leads to increased student achievement. When people feel valued and respected, I think that that translates into better job performance and ultimately academic achievement for students. Part 2.
Part 2 was, are you familiar with culture and climate surveys, and have you used them in the past to inform your decision-making process?
I have. We have used culture and climate surveys, in particular during COVID, as we are transitioning back to in-person learning. And we used the, not necessarily a culture and climate survey, but the youth risk behavior survey at the high school, which gives you really good data around decision-making for adolescents and kind of healthy choices or not so healthy choices that they're making, which can then inform programming. I've said today, the worst thing that we can do is ask people for information, for their opinions, for their thoughts, and then do nothing with it. And I sometimes worry that we produce culture and climate surveys, we ask questions, and people feel like they weren't heard, or that it was a futile exercise because the end result wasn't anything that they felt that they had shared. And so surveys are one thing, but following them up with in-person meetings and forums to release that information and to share the results, I think that adds a layer of transparency, a core value, because some people are skeptical that, you know, what did they do with that? And to take the culture and climate survey data and to present it to the school committee at a school committee meeting so that the public has access to that information, and then seeing the follow-through, that this is what the data is telling us, and these are the subsequent decisions we have made as a result.
Thank you.
Hello.
Hello.
Please tell us about the experiences you've had with collective bargaining on both management and the teacher side of the table. What is the role of the superintendent? It's part 1.
Okay.
And part 2, if you needed to make changes in a budget in the middle of an academic year, how would you go about doing so? And how would you communicate the need of these changes to all stakeholders?
Right. Did you say changes in the budget?
Correct.
Thank you. In Marblehead, we had 6 unions. We had the Unit A Teachers Union, paraprofessionals, tutors, cafeteria workers, custodians, and permanent substitutes, of which there were 2. So they were all negotiated in the same year. I think the superintendent's role is critical, along with a representative. I don't know if you have a subcommittee of the school committee for collective bargaining, but also legal counsel, MTA often has a rep. We were fortunate in Marblehead to negotiate a 5% over 3-year contract, which is unheard of now. And to be fair, it was October of 2020, and the president of the teachers union saw that we were in completely uncharted territory, and so we negotiated 1% midway through year one, 1% day one of year two, and 1% midway through year two, and then 2% for the third year. Lynn changed that when they went 5, 5, and 5. And I think that that has set districts up, and I certainly don't blame the Lynn Public Schools. They have their collective bargaining process. But I think the superintendent is an integral part of that, and having a relationship with the teachers union. I'm proud of the fact that during the 3 years I was in Marblehead, we had no grievances. As a high school principal on Nantucket, I had no unresolved grievances. The president of the teachers union is a reference for me to speak to the work that we did. I meet with the union leadership every week, so that helps to address issues before they become problems. And I think too often in education now, when issues arise, they are approached as battles to be won, as opposed to problems to be solved. And for me, issues are problems to be solved. How do we collectively work toward a resolution that both sides, and that's part of the collective bargaining process, is openly communicating using data, historical data. If you are having attendance issues in the district, if you have excessive absenteeism and you're wanting to change language in your collective bargaining agreement, bringing that forward with the data to support it, to say 80% of our staff members have 12 or more absences every year. I'm making up numbers as I go, but being able to make a quantitative case for qualitative change. And your second question was changes in the budget. My first year as a high school principal on Nantucket, they found an $800,000 deficit in the budget mid-year. So the housing stipend that I had been hired under was one of the first things to disappear, but we sat around the table as an administrative team and identified potential ways of closing that budget gap. And that's how I would approach it as I approached it as budget development last year, that everyone has a voice, and then collectively we prioritize the list of things that would close a budget gap or make up for a budget deficit mid-year.
Thank you.
Welcome. Professional development is one key way to support and maintain an impactful, inclusive district culture. And when changes are implemented, all stakeholders should understand how to communicate with our school community about the priorities of inclusivity and accessibility. As the district's leader, how would you ensure that we develop an inclusive culture that is community-wide? How would you communicate information and get all staff on the same page about efforts to improve the inclusivity of our school events, our policies, and our curriculum in a way that fosters positivity and collaboration? And lastly, can you give an example of how you involve staff in an improvement process to address a complex issue, and what your main considerations were as you navigated that collaborative process?
It's a lot there. Thank you. And I'm glad that there is a CPAC representative at the table. I think that that's a very important and very indicative of Groton-Dunstable and how you're approaching this search. First, I believe all students are general education students first. Some students need extension and acceleration. Other students require support services to access their education. I believe in the least restrictive environment, and are there ways to be more inclusive? As a high school principal, one of the first things that I did was eliminate teacher recommendations for courses and any requisite pre-tests for accessing an honors or an advanced placement course. I wanted students to have agency to make those decisions on their own, and so we adopted open enrollment, meaning that a student could enroll in an honors or an advanced placement course and make the decision for themselves. Wow, this is really hard. I have overstretched. I'm going to change to the college preparatory level, rather than walking up to an adult and saying, can I sign up for Honors English 2 next year? And be told no. So open enrollment has been a hallmark for me of who I am as an administrator, looking for ways to be inclusive and to provide support structures for students who may need a substantially separate environment for some of their academic day, but are there opportunities for them to be in general education courses? When I was on Nantucket, we had some vocational programs that weren't Chapter 74 approved, but we had a culinary program, a wood shop, and an auto shop, and we were able to have a number of our students who were in substantially separate programs participate in those courses with their peers, and those were remarkable opportunities. We have unified sports leagues we sent our students out for competitions in Special Olympics. And so looking for clubs and activities that promote inclusion and increase a sense of belonging for all students. And I think, facilitating that with building leaders, looking for areas where there isn't achievement. As I look at Groton-Dunstable data, I think I might have mentioned this maybe here or in another forum today, but at the 10th, 8th, 5th, and 4th grade, you have 0 students who receive special education services exceeding expectations in mathematics and literacy. I think that that's something worthy of our attention, how other subgroups are being represented and exceeding expectations, but at 4 different grade levels, our special education students are not. Is that an issue of service delivery? Is that an issue of access? And so I would want to explore that more.
Thank you.
Sorry about that.
Round 2?
Round 2.
Almost there. Yeah. What strategies are you going to implement to support the employment of more diverse faculty, and what do you plan to do to support this initiative? And have you implemented, and what incentives have you implemented to maintain employment morale? A little more piece to it that I wrote. When you cannot offer monetary rewards financially, what other ideas do you have to keep talented teachers in our district? And when I say diverse faculty, I mean on all levels.
Sure.
Yep.
Sure. I think that this has been a conversation at the district level, at the state level. The Massachusetts Association of School Committees has had the READY initiatives for attracting and retaining a diverse workforce. DESE offered an 8-month program last year, of which Marblehead participated in, When I was on Nantucket, we partnered with a university through the placement office to offer programs for diverse faculty to have housing incentives. Living on the island is not cheap, and attracting a diverse workforce is one thing, but it's also retaining them. It is difficult to be the only educator of color in a building. And what support structures are in place so that they don't feel so isolated? Do you have a mentoring program? Have you connected educators with support resources that they need so that they don't feel that they are alone in the work and that they are valued contributors in the work that they're doing in their buildings? And too often when we have limited diversity in a district, we call on, probably with the best of intention, those educators to be the spokesperson for all things diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I think that that is sometimes what leads to people leaving a district. And so how do you, is it partnering with a college or university? Is it working with the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education through their programs and offering opportunities for advancement through your system? Can you bring people in as tutors or paraprofessionals and provide a pathway for them to get certified as a classroom educator and work up through the system? That's an incentive for diversifying your workforce. And then just acknowledging the good work that all educators do. I think you were talking about morale. And when I was in Marblehead, we had a staff shirt for everyone in the first year that I was here, and they could do dress down on Fridays and called it Same Shirt, Same Team. And then the next year, we made that a faculty competition for designing the staff shirt for the year. And so to walk through buildings and have staff be like, Dr. Buckey, same shirt, same team, gave a kind of spirit of teamwork and that we are one as a school district. And so bringing people together, acknowledging the hard work that they do and valuing it, popping into a classroom, letting a teacher know, and that comes through relationship building and trust with your administrative team, that they say, by the way, our fourth grade teacher did this amazing executive function activity today. Would you mind acknowledging that? And so popping in the classroom and saying, hey, your principal was raving about you. It doesn't always have to be a brownie on Teacher Appreciation Day, but it's the day-to-day and who you are as the leader of the district in acknowledging and valuing the work that they're doing.
Thank you.
So we have many community members and elected officials that flat out reject our budget and the administration because they feel that there is significant waste in the budget. They show that they don't understand how a 21st century education is delivered by saying, we didn't have this when I was in school and it was good enough for me. As a result, they also target people in the administration. So a few questions. One, have you been in this situation in the past? Could you
Yes.
please tell me about it? Two, how do you explain to someone the difference in terms of what's required to deliver 21st century education versus a 20th century education and the costs associated with it? And lastly, how do you address the concerns of these individuals to gain enough support to have a budget approved at town meeting, as well as a positive opinion of the school district and its employees?
Yeah. My former superintendent had this wonderful decade-by-decade analysis of public education, what we have added to it over the years from like math and science during Sputnik to DARE in the 80s to latchkey kids to vocational education, and budgets have not kept pace with the expectations that we have put on public education. And the Department of Education puts forth unfunded mandates for us, whether they're with our English language learners, whether they're with our students who receive special services, and the expectations. I think you have to use your data to tell the story, but you also have to have someone as a spokesperson for that data that people believe and trust. And that is built over time and eliminated in an instant. And so as you present budgets and make the case for when you were a student, this was our enrollment, this was the composition of our faculty, this is how many positions that we had. I think a couple years ago you may have provided a retirement incentive as you develop the budget process. Those sort of thinking outside the box speaks to the community that you recognize that there is a disparity between revenue and expenses, but making the case for the expense side of it, I'll go back to the OSD 14% increase. Johnny Groton, Susie Dunstable wouldn't know that. And to see the financial impact, this was not something that was budgeted for, but this is the impact on our district and our students. These are the step and lane changes that are a result. But these are also the things that we have done to make savings. And I think that communicating that out, but also having a spokesperson that people trust and believe in, is an equal part of that equation.
Thank you.
You're up.
Sorry. So right. How do you ensure that the curriculum taught is up to date and evidence-based? What tools would you utilize to assess the efficacy of it?
Instructional rounds, being out in classrooms, working with educators, making sure that you have robust professional development, that if you're implementing a new literacy curriculum, that teachers have the resources that they need to implement it with fidelity. There is nothing more gratifying than being in a district that did not have an articulated scope and sequence and going into a classroom at one school and seeing something that was diametrically the opposite of another school in the same grade level classroom, to going to the middle school and seeing one 7th grade social studies class talking about westward expansion, going across the hall or down a floor to the other team and going into the social studies class and seeing them talking about westward expansion. That fits to the art and science of education for me. The science is having the articulated scope and sequence, that this is what we're doing and when. It doesn't eliminate the art from teachers of providing instruction in ways that deliver the material in ways that are unique for them, and giving students the opportunity to have access to the same information and material.
Thank you.
So to follow up on her question, what tools do you utilize to assess the efficacy?
We have used, the state has an instructional rounds protocol that they provide for culturally responsive teaching practices, for inclusive teaching practices, and using those metrics. And then as you debrief after classroom rounds, of using that to say, did we observe this in that classroom? And if not, what feedback could we provide to the educator in order to meet this standard?
So my question, the next question, I'd like to discuss your high-level plan of how you'd measure the performance of GD against other districts. There are many different ways to compare a district or individual school against districts. Websites like U.S. News and World Reports, Great Schools, rankings in newspapers like Boston Globe, MCAS rankings, our own internal math and reading assessments, etc. Which rankings matter, which do not, and why? Groton-Dunstable or one of its schools might go down in a ranking, such as one of the websites or news outlets. Some community members and school committee members then become upset, and a perception starts to grow that the district is failing in academic performance under your leadership. How do you respond to this situation? The previous administration and school committee put together what we call market baskets, which we compare ourselves. And those market baskets have been chosen basically following, because they follow similar metrics, either in enrollment, percentage of students that are economically disadvantaged, districts demonstrating growth in math and ELA, so on and so forth, or per pupil spending. How aware of you of this are you of the strategy, and do you agree with it, and why or why not?
Oh. Well, certainly any candidate is going to do their homework coming into the district. And so for me, a solid place to look is the DESE school and district profiles. That gives you a snapshot into the data and historical data going back to 10, 12 years. And so looking at trends gives you everything from salary, where Groton-Dunstable against your DART districts is coming in 8th out of 10 in your average teacher salary. Your number one, as I've pointed out, of your DART comparisons in ELA, math, and student growth percentage, that's beating Weston and Wilmington and Scituate. So, you know, that's a source of pride. But you're 7th in ELA and math in grades 3 to 8. I think when you talk to district leaders, when the U.S. News and World Report rankings come out, the Boston Magazine rankings come out, if you're in the top 10, that is a very accurate representation of our district, and it is a solid metric. If you're not doing so well, you find ways to say, well, they take this into consideration, and this isn't a fair indicator. What I often have pointed out to school committees when I particularly made presentations on AP performance was people game the system with AP results in they have barriers to the courses that you have to have a certain GPA or a teacher recommendation or a qualifying score to take the advanced placement class. And then if you're not doing great, they encourage you not to take the exam. When I was a high school principal, anyone could take the AP course, but you were required to take the AP exam. And that meant to me, we're getting an accurate representation of the data. That we are not saying, okay, these students cannot take the AP class, and of the students who took the AP class, we're only going to let those that we're convinced are going to do a 4 or 5 sit for the exam. And so, yeah, it's nice to be able to tout 90% of our students get a 4 or 5, but if you've set it up so that not all students have equitable access to the course, and those that do have access are discouraged from taking the exam, and I think that you can use a number of metrics like for your AP, about 74.5% of students were getting a 3, 4, or 5. 5 years ago, that was higher, and there were more people taking the exam. And so exploring that, why do we have fewer students? Is it that you had to eliminate AP offerings because of budget? That could be an answer to that. But if you have fewer students and a lower score, that's a red flag for me as you look at district data. And so I think comparing yourselves to, you know, the DART, you might not agree with all 10 districts that are listed by the department. We certainly didn't in Marblehead, but using fair comparisons, looking at your per pupil expenditure, looking at teacher salaries, looking at teacher retention, student attendance. Those are all indicators. You have a special education population that is increasing over time. You have an ELL population that has increased over time. Are we looking at the data for those subgroups and how they're performing? At the same time, I have heard today pretty regularly that there's a disparity between male achievement in the district and female achievement, in particular when it comes to English language arts. Wanting to unpack that and to find out what are the root causes of that and what have we done to address it and has it been successful. So I think rankings can be manipulated. They can be a source of celebration if they are a genuine reflection of what's actually happening in the district and not a representation of a random regression analysis of factors that might not be important to the school committee or our stakeholders.
Thank you.
Did I answer all of those?
I think so.
Okay. I'm going to trust you, Faye.
Halfway done, we're almost there. The field of education is constantly changing. What methods do you use to keep up to date with the latest developments and issues in education? In your previous positions, how have you modified your approaches in response to these changes? Can you provide an instance where you effectively implemented a new educational trend or overcome a current obstacle in a school or educational district?
Yeah. I think as educators, we need to model lifelong learning, and in doing so, provide opportunities to our staff to see us engaged in professional development. I think that one thing that lends credibility, increases morale, is for the superintendent, the assistant superintendent, the building principal to be active participants in the professional development that they have proposed. It is disheartening for educators who have spent the morning teaching to be required to go to professional development in the afternoon, not to see the building principal there participating, not to see the superintendent there. And I think it's important to walk that walk and not just talk that talk. This is an important professional development. I won't be part of it, but it's really important that you're there and participating. I think AI comes to mind as an educational initiative that initially, much like cell phones, people were like, no, it's bad. We have to keep students from it. They're going to cheat. It's going to write all their papers. It's going to lead to rampant plagiarism. And as AI has evolved, teachers finding a place for leveraging that in ways that are responsible digital citizens, so that, you know, students aren't just saying, oh, I have to write a paper on the Great Gatsby. Write a paper on the Great Gatsby for me, and then just taking what the computer spits out, but writing it, getting some ideas for prompts, having it edited. There are ways of leveraging technology, and I think the knee-jerk initially was that no, there's not a place for it. But cell phones, a good example. Many schools have the shoe caddies, and they want the students to put the cell phone in the shoe caddy. But you go next door, and a teacher has students using a online poll survey that they can fill out from their phone, participating in a Kahoot activity, where they're leveraging something that the students want to use, and they will be using it moving forward of what is 27 degrees Celsius in Fahrenheit. We probably learned that conversion. Many of us probably don't remember, but Siri can tell me in about 2 seconds what that is. And so supporting responsible use of technology, I think, is an example to what you're asking.
Thank you.
To what extent does community feedback impact your decision-making process? And can you provide an example of a time that you had to make a decision that may have been contrary to public opinion, but that you felt it was in the best interest of students? And how did you go about arriving at your decision and then defending that decision?
Yeah, I'm going to step right on a landmine that everyone today has advised me not to do, but I will call it recess gate. I'm going to look to see whose eyes lit up first. In Marblehead, they had 2 elementary recesses, and they were 15 minutes each. And if you've ever done an elementary recess, it's not 15 minutes, particularly in January, when you're putting on snow pants and hats and gloves, and you're lining up, and then you're walking down the hall, and you're going outside, and you have recess, and then you're lining up and walking back in, and taking off wet hats and mittens and gloves and snow pants. We were losing about an hour of instructional time a day for recess. I think free play is important. I think recess is important, but for us not to be meeting the time on learning standard for the state, and for our teachers to be able to say, I can't teach the math curriculum with fidelity because it requires a 60-minute lesson and I only have 48 minutes. So that was the right decision, and we implemented an intervention block called a WIN block, which is what I need, and students who were above grade level, who needed extension and acceleration activities could use that time. We used our iReady data platform to provide feedback to teachers for how best to use the WIN block. It's an opportunity for intervention for students who are struggling to have that time to meet with a teacher, to reteach a lesson or work through a concept again. The communication of it was we eliminated recess. And so you can imagine there was a lot of community feedback on that. It was the right decision, in abysmal communication of it. Was it effective? Yes. Our MCAS scores this year went up in every grade level in both ELA, math and science, and in sometimes by double digits. And so, right decision, but poorly executed and communicated. So if I had to do that again, I would make the same decisions, but engage stakeholders more in why that decision needed to be made.
Thank you.
Tell us about your experience working in the curriculum area that might include identifying a need to revise curriculum to align with DESI guidance and research, implementing a new curriculum, or assessing the curricula that's already in place. What did you learn from these experiences, and how would you use what you learned in our district?
Say the first part of the question again, please.
Your experience working in the curriculum area that might include identifying a need to revise curriculum to align with DESI guidance and research.
Yeah. So the department is regularly releasing new curriculum frameworks. Not most recently, but recently the social studies frameworks, which changed 8th grade to civics, in working with districts that really shifted what was taught at grade levels, whether world history was in the 9th grade, US 1, US 2, what is the sequence of that. So working with building principals to implement the new frameworks to make sure that our existing scope and sequence is aligned with that. This summer, they came out with new health guidelines, and to their credit, the department gives an feedback period. And so I pushed that information out to our families, saying the department is looking to revise the health frameworks, which really hadn't been done since 1999. So I'm thinking we would all agree that 24, 25 years later, what we know about health and wellness and public health has changed dramatically, but giving families the opportunities to weigh in, because some controversial topics are talked about in health. And then once those frameworks are adopted from the department, making sure that they're communicated to school committee, how we will revise the Groton-Dunstable health delivery or social studies delivery, and making sure that then we are following up with those instructional rounds of seeing how educators are implementing it and making sure that it is aligned and being taught with fidelity.
Thank you.
How would your particular leadership style make our teachers feel supported and help you to identify and address their concerns? And how does your leadership style foster relationships that lead to improved retention of our valued and talented staff members? If we were to ask families, students, and teachers who have worked with you in the past, what would they say was your biggest impact on the culture of the school community?
That's a great question to end with. I have always been a family-first leader. This work we do is hard and is difficult, and educators too often have an imbalance of the work-family life. And so I have always been attuned to people when they say, I have a situation with my spouse, with my parents, with my dog, of putting family first and knowing that I see a lesson that I learned as a superintendent, maybe the hard way, is as a first superintendent, as a first-year superintendent in COVID, I wanted people to know that I was hyper-responsive, that if they sent me an email within 5 minutes, they would get a response, or I would funnel it to the most appropriate person to respond. What I didn't realize was that a principal or a director getting an email from the superintendent at 11:47 at night or 4:45 in the morning, because I go to the gym at 5, was debilitating. And I was creating, unbeknownst to me, an expectation that they should be working at 11:47 and they should be working at 4:45. And so I apologized to our leadership team because I said I had no idea the impact. I was just trying to be responsive to staff and families that they have these myriad questions about the pandemic. And so I think being able to be vulnerable, being able to admit when you make a mistake, being able to be human, have a sense of humor. There's a lot of funny stuff that happens in schools, and to be able to laugh with your colleagues and enjoy the work and to find the funny. I'm president of the Nantucket Comedy Festival, and they have an educational program called Stand Up and Learn, which is using stand-up comedy as a vehicle for students to tell their story and to find their voice and to gain public speaking skills. And so I think being real, being authentic, being vulnerable, able to admit when you've made a mistake, saying, I don't know, but I'll get the answer. Sometimes I think leaders think I have to have an answer, so I'll make it up and ask for forgiveness later. We need to ask permission more instead of forgiveness.
Thank you.
That's it. Now we're going to go around one more time. Thank you.
Oh my goodness, I thought you were serious. You were going to go around again. I was like, I'm going to need another water.
I got a good deadpan delivery, I guess. So that calls me, or that's the last question of our interview with John Buckey. QR code, survey link is up here. Definitely want to get feedback from everybody. Mr. Buckey, we are going to be reconvening as a school committee on the 24th, hopefully to make a decision. with an expectation that between the 24th and the 31st, we'll be doing contract negotiations with an announcement on the 31st of who we hopefully have had a clean contract negotiation with and will be our new superintendent. On that note, good night, everybody, and thank you. Meeting is adjourned.